The coyotes were the first sign that something was wrong. Clara had lived on this ridge for 5 years, ever since the fever took her husband and left her with nothing but a stubborn silence and a rifle that knew her hands better than any person ever had. She knew the sounds of her mountain. She knew the whisper of wind through the pines, the sharp crack of a deadfall branch in the winter cold, and she knew the yipping chorus of the coyotes as they hunted rabbits in the gulch below. But this morning, their song was different. It wasn't the sound of the hunt. It was the sound of a feast that had already been laid out for them. There was a frantic energy to it, a nervous excitement. Their ears would be pinned, their tails low. It was the sound they made when something bigger, something dangerous, had already made a kill and left scraps behind. It was the sound of blood in the air. Clara grabbed her rifle, its familiar weight a comfort against her shoulder. She didn't hesitate. Fear was a luxury for people in towns, people with neighbors to call on. Out here, there was only curiosity, caution, and the cold, hard math of survival. She moved down the slope, her boots crunching on the frost-covered stone. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if the whole mountain was holding its breath. And that's when she saw him. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, curled up beneath a rocky ledge like a discarded doll. He was half covered in sand and dark, dried blood that crusted his simple leather tunic. His black hair was matted to his cheeks, and one of his legs was bent at an angle that made Clara's own bones ache in sympathy. It looked like it had been caught and twisted, snapped like a twig. She was 10 feet away when his eyes shot open. They were wild, dark, and full of a terror so deep it was silent. He didn't scream, he couldn't. His lips were cracked and swollen, his throat too raw and dry to make a sound. He just stared, a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her movements were smooth. She dropped to one knee, the rifle held loosely at her side. Instinct, sharp and maternal, sliced through the cold fear. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you." The boy blinked once, a slow, painful movement. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he was gone, passed out into the waiting darkness. She scrambled forward, her mind racing. Was he from a raided wagon train? A runaway from a harsh settlement? But then she saw the details. The intricate beadwork on his moccasins, the 2 small, sharp feathers braided carefully into his dark hair, and her blood ran cold. Apache. And not just any Apache. The craftsmanship, the quality of the leather. This was someone important. This was someone's son. Someone who would be missed. Someone people would come looking for. She stood there, frozen, the silent boy at her feet, and the entire dangerous world pressing in on her. Helping him could mean trouble, the kind of trouble that ends with fire and bullets. Leaving him here meant he'd be dead by nightfall, food for the very coyotes that had led her to him. Leaving him would make her no better than the men who had chased his people from these hills, the men who saw a child and saw only a savage. She made a decision. She didn't ride into the nearby town of Redemption for the marshal. She didn't call for help. She wrapped the small, feverish boy in her own thick coat, lifted his shockingly light body into her arms, and carried him back up the slope to the one place she knew was safe. She took him to her cabin on the ridge, a place where no rancher ever rode and no lawman ever bothered to follow, a place she had built to be invisible, but she was about to find out that she had just lit a signal fire, and the whole mountain was watching. That first night was a descent into hell. The boy, who she'd laid carefully on her own cot, was burning up from the inside out. He thrashed against the blankets, his small hands clutching at the air as he muttered and cried out in a language she didn't understand, a river of guttural sounds and pained whispers. The fever had him, and it was trying to drag him down into the grave. Clara worked tirelessly. She cooled his blistering forehead with cloths dipped in snowmelt. She used the tip of a spoon to drip lukewarm broth, drop by painful drop, between his cracked lips. The silence of her cabin, usually a comfort, now felt like a crushing weight. So she talked. She whispered old stories her mother used to tell her, folk tales of clever foxes and stubborn mountain goats. She filled the space with the sound of her voice, a constant low murmur meant to anchor him to the world of the living. He never woke up. Not really. He was lost in the delirious haze, fighting a war she couldn't see. Late into the night, when the fire had burned down to glowing orange embers and exhaustion was finally pulling her under, Clara slumped into the rocking chair beside the cot. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, something was touching her hand. She looked down. The boy's small brown hand had reached out from under the blanket and found hers in the dark. His fingers were weak, but they curled around her own with a desperate strength. Without a second thought, she held it, a connection, a silent plea. And in that moment, something shifted. Outside, in the deep, dark canyon, a single owl cried out. It was answered a moment later by a second, different owl call, one she had never heard on this mountain before. It wasn't a sound of nature. It was a signal. She didn't know it then, but by taking this child's hand, by choosing to care, she had tripped a wire. She had sent a message across the canyons and peaks, a message written not in smoke, but in compassion. She had just announced her presence to people who had a vested interest in the boy sleeping in her bed, and they were already on their way. By morning, the world had turned white. A thick blanket of snow had fallen overnight, silencing the landscape and trapping her in a pristine, beautiful prison. The good news was, the boy's fever had broken. His breathing was deeper, more even, and the heat radiating from his skin had subsided to a normal warmth. Relief washed over Clara. She grabbed a wooden bucket and stepped outside to gather fresh snow for water. She took 2 steps from her door and froze. Tracks. They weren't hers. They weren't the boy's. And they sure as hell didn't belong to any deer or rabbit. They were hoof prints. Wide, unshod pony tracks pressed deep into the fresh snow. They were impossibly fresh, no more than an hour old. They circled her cabin once, a perfect, deliberate ring. Then a second time, closer. Then they vanished back into the thick stands of pine trees that bordered her property. There was no knock on the door, no voice calling out. Just silent mounted riders watching her from the cover of the woods. Judging her. Her breath caught in her throat. A cold dread, far worse than the winter air, seeped into her bones. They knew he was here. She scrambled back inside, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She slammed the heavy wooden bolt across the door, a futile gesture she hadn't used in years. Her eyes darted around the small one-room cabin, suddenly seeing it as a trap. Then, she heard a rustle from the cot. The boy was awake. His dark eyes were open, no longer hazed with fever, but weary and cautious. He flinched when he saw her, a small, instinctual movement, but he didn't try to pull away. He just watched her, his gaze sharp and intelligent. "It's all right," Clara whispered, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. She knelt beside him. "You're safe here. You've been very sick." He tried to push himself up but winced, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips as he clutched his side. "Easy," she said, gently steadying him. "You've got a cracked rib, maybe more than one. You need to be still." His eyes weren't on her face anymore. They were fixed on his own waist. A small beaded leather pouch was tied there with a leather cord. Through all the cleaning and bandaging, she had been careful to leave it untouched. She knew it was important. Medicine, maybe. A sacred object. It wasn't hers to know. Now she reached for it, not to take it, but to gesture toward it. "I figured this mattered," she said simply. The boy's gaze flickered up to hers. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth behind her eyes. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Nantan," he whispered, his voice a dry, hoarse rasp. "Is that your name?" she asked gently. He nodded again. "Nantan." A small, genuine smile touched Clara's lips for the first time in days. "I'm Clara." He didn't repeat her name. He just kept watching her, his small face a mask of careful neutrality. But the fear in his eyes had been replaced by something else. Curiosity. Crack. Outside, a heavy branch snapped under the weight of the snow. It was a normal sound, one she'd heard 1,000 times. But not today. Today, it sounded like a gunshot. Clara shot to her feet, moving silently to the window. She peered through a tiny crack in the wooden shutters. She saw nothing but a world of white and green, snow-laden pines standing like silent sentinels. But she felt it. A pressure in the air. The feeling of being watched by more than just birds. The mountain was holding its breath again, waiting. "Someone's coming for you, aren't they?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. Nantan didn't answer. He didn't have to. She knew. He hadn't been abandoned. He hadn't been left for dead. He had been lost. He was injured in a fight, and his people had been forced to retreat. But they hadn't forgotten him. They had come back. And now they were out there, in the trees, watching, waiting, and trying to decide one simple thing. Was she a friend, or was she the enemy? That evening, as dusk bled purple and gray across the snowy landscape, Clara made a choice. She didn't bolt the door. She didn't load her rifle and place it by the window. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that if they wanted to come in, a wooden bolt wouldn't stop them. A rifle would only get her killed. Instead, she moved with a slow, deliberate calm. She added wood to the fire, coaxing the flames high so that a warm, welcoming light filled the small cabin. She prepared a simple stew, the smell of rabbit and wild herbs filling the room. It was an act of faith, or maybe foolishness. She was setting a table for ghosts. She was trying to show them what she was. Not a captor, not a threat, just a woman who had chosen to save a child when the rest of the world would have walked right on by. Nantan watched her every move from the cot. He was sitting up now, propped against her pillows, the old wool blanket clutched around his small shoulders. He hadn't spoken much, but his eyes followed her with an unnerving intensity. As she brought him a small bowl of the stew, he reached out. His fingers didn't grab for the food. They rested gently on her wrist. His touch was light, but it sent a jolt through her. It wasn't a gesture of gratitude, not exactly. It was something more profound. It was trust. And in that moment, she knew she had done the right thing, no matter what came next. Deep in the forest, cloaked by the gathering dark and the falling snow, 12 riders moved through the trees without a sound. Their horses, bred for stealth and silence, picked their way through the drifts as if they were floating on air. They had been watching the cabin for 2 days. They had seen her find the boy. They had seen her carry him home. They had seen her tend to his wounds. They had seen everything. And now, the time for watching was over. The time for judgment had arrived. The crows were the first to announce their arrival. Not with a call, but with a scream. 3 black shapes erupted from the snow-heavy pines just as the last light of day was failing. They wheeled and circled wildly above the ridge, their frantic cries tearing through the evening calm. It was an alarm. Inside the cabin, Nantan sat up straighter. The weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intelligence. He wasn't a lost child anymore. He was the son of a chief, and he knew what was coming. He turned his head slowly towards the window, listening to a sound she couldn't yet hear. "They are here," he whispered. His voice was no longer raspy, but clear and steady. Clara's hand instinctively tightened on the stock of the rifle she'd left leaning against the hearth. Her knuckles were white. Will they come to the door? He shook his head slowly. Not yet. They are making sure. Making sure of what? She didn't ask. She crossed to the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She moved the rough curtain aside just a fraction of an inch and peered out. At first, the woods looked empty, a silent, monochrome world of white snow and black trunks. Then she saw it. A flicker of movement. The barest edge of a dark feather against the white bark of an aspen, the swish of a horse's tail, and then, for a split second, a glint of bone-white paint across a broad, naked chest. Her breath hitched. There wasn't just one. She scanned the tree line, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. She counted 5, then 8, then 12. 12 silent, mounted figures materializing from the forest like vengeful spirits. They sat on their ponies, perfectly still, watching her cabin. She let the curtain fall. She swallowed against the dryness in her throat. They've been out there all day, haven't they? Nantan nodded. They do not know what you are. A strange sort of calm washed over Clara. The waiting was over. The fear of the unknown was gone, replaced by the terrifying certainty of the present. Then I suppose I should show them. Nantan looked at her, his dark eyes wide with a flicker of surprise. You are not afraid. Clara managed a small, sad smile. I've lived on this mountain alone for 5 years, Nantan. My husband and my baby girl are buried just over that ridge. It isn't death I'm afraid of. It's being misunderstood when all I meant to do was right. And with that, she walked to the door, unlatched it, and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She walked slowly, deliberately, her hands empty and open at her sides. She left the rifle inside. This wouldn't be one with gunpowder. She walked to the edge of the clearing to where her firewood stack ended and the forest began. And then she just stood there, a lone, small figure in the vast, intimidating wilderness, and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world was silent, save for the whisper of the wind. The riders remained like statues carved from shadow and ice. It was a test of nerve. Then one of them moved. A single rider urged his pony forward, separating from the group and stepping into the dim light of the clearing. He was older, his face a mask of deep lines and stern authority. His long braids were streaked with gray, and his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to hold the cold, hard wisdom of 100 winters. A chief. He stopped his horse 20 feet from her. "Where is the boy?" he asked. His English was broken, but his voice was a low, powerful rumble that carried easily through the still air. It was steady, but it was not kind. Clara didn't tremble. She simply pointed a thumb back towards the cabin. "He is safe. He was hurt. I took him in." The chief's eyes narrowed, scanning her from head to toe. "Did you touch his medicine?" "His pouch?" Clara asked. "No, I left it with him. He has it now." The chief's stony expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes. "Why?" Clara met his gaze without wavering. "Because he's a child," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Because he was bleeding to death in the snow, and because when I look at him I don't see an Apache. I see a boy who needed someone." A heavy silence fell over the clearing. The wind died down. The world seemed to be listening. Then, a second rider moved forward. This one was younger, taller, his face sharp and angular like a drawn arrowhead. His eyes burned with a fierce, suspicious fire. He radiated menace. "We found the tracks of 3 white men," the young warrior said, his voice laced with venom. "We found blood. We thought you took him, that you were one of them." "No," Clara said quietly. "I found him after they were gone." Just then, the cabin door creaked open behind her. Nantan stood in the doorway, wrapped in her old wool blanket, his small frame silhouetted by the warm firelight within. "She does not lie, grandfather," he called out, his voice surprisingly strong. "The white men hurt me. This woman, she made the fever go away." The riders exchanged glances. The tension in the air shifted, cracking like thin ice. The chief, Taza, stared at his grandson, then back at Clara. Slowly, deliberately, he swung his leg over his pony and dismounted. "Then we will speak," he said, his tone still gruff, but holding a new note of something other than hostility. "Inside, if you have nothing to hide." Clara didn't hesitate. She stepped aside, gesturing to the open door of her home. "You are welcome at my fire." The cabin, which had always felt spacious enough for one, had never felt so small. Chief Taza did not bring all 12 of his warriors inside. He brought 2. His son, Chaska, the tall, fierce warrior with the burning eyes, and a woman whose name she would later learn was Awanasa. She was older than Chaska, but younger than Taza, with intricate beadwork braided into her dark hair and a gaze that missed nothing. She didn't speak, but her eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of the room, the herbs drying above the window, the neat stitching on Nantan's bandages, the worn rocking chair, the single, faded portrait of Clara's late husband on the mantel. Clara kept the fire burning high. It wasn't just for warmth anymore. It was a shared space, a neutral ground. Nantan sat on a low stool between her and his grandfather, a silent, alert bridge between 2 worlds. Taza didn't sit down right away. He walked the perimeter of the small room, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. He ran a finger along the dusty mantel, his eyes lingering on the photograph. "You live alone," he stated. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Since my husband passed. No one comes up here, not unless they're lost." Taza finally turned and sat, crossing his legs with a surprising grace. He looked from her to Nantan. Then perhaps that is what he was, lost. Clara met his gaze. "He was more than lost," she said, her voice dropping lower. "He was hunted." Chaska, who stood by the door like a coiled snake, let out a soft, dangerous sound. His jaw tightened. "We found the tracks of 3 riders, white men. Their horses were shod. There was blood on the snow, but no bodies." "He never told me who they were," Clara replied, choosing her words with care. "He didn't have to." Taza nodded slowly, a deep, thoughtful expression on his weathered face. He turned his gaze to his grandson. "Nantan, it is different to hear it from your own mouth. Tell us." The boy hesitated, his eyes darting to Clara, then to his grandfather. He took a deep breath, and then he began to speak. The words that tumbled out of him were in his own tongue, a low, trembling torrent of sound. Clara couldn't understand a single word, but she understood the terror, the pain and the grief woven into them. She saw the story in the way his small hands clenched into fists, in the tears that welled in his eyes but refused to fall. He spoke of a surprise attack, of his father fighting bravely, of being separated in the chaos. He spoke of running until his lungs burned and his legs snapped, of hiding in the rocks, sure he was going to die. As he spoke, Taza closed his eyes, his face a stoic mask, listening with more than just his ears. Chaska stared into the flames of the fire, his handsome face contorted with a silent, burning rage. Awanasa watched Nantan, her expression softening with a profound sadness. When the boy finally finished, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the cabin. The only sound was the crackle and pop of the fire. "He was brave," Clara said softly, breaking the stillness. "When I found him, he didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just held on." The woman, Awanasa, finally spoke. Her voice was like the low hum of a river, calm and deep. She looked directly at Clara, And you fed him. You cleaned his wounds. You gave him your bed. You sang to him in words he did not know. Clara was stunned. How could she know that? Yes, I did. He needed more than just medicine for his body. He needed comfort for his spirit. Awanasa nodded, a small, approving smile touching her lips. Our ways say that a spirit in fear cannot heal. Taza opened his eyes. He rose to his feet in one smooth motion. He was not a tall man, but he possessed an undeniable gravity, a presence that filled the entire room. He stepped toward Clara, stopping directly in front of her. You gave us back more than a child, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had kept hidden until now. You gave us back our blood, our future. Then he did something that shocked her to her core. He bent at the waist, not a full bow, but something older, a gesture of profound respect that transcended language and culture. We do not forget a debt like this, he said. Clara's throat tightened, and she couldn't speak. I didn't do it to be remembered, she finally managed to whisper. All the more reason we will, Taza replied. He turned to leave, but Chaska stepped forward. The burning anger in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something unreadable and complex. He looked at Clara, truly looked at her for the first time. There are debts born from kindness, he said, his voice low and intense. And some cannot be repaid with words alone. Outside, the wind rose, howling around the corners of the cabin. But for the first time since she'd found the boy, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a song. That night, they lit a second fire. Not in the hearth, but outside, in the center of the clearing. The warriors cleared a wide circle in the snow, and soon a great bonfire was roaring, its flames leaping high into the night, casting dancing shadows on the pines and sending a column of sparks up to meet the stars. Taza asked Clara to join them. She was hesitant, unsure of her place, but Awanasa took her gently by the arm and led her to the circle. This was not a celebration a settler would recognize. There were no loud cheers, no drinking. They sat close together, their knees nearly touching, forming a ring of shared warmth and silent communion. They didn't exclude her, but they didn't cater to her either. They spoke in their own language, telling stories that flowed like an ancient river. Chaska, the fierce warrior, sat beside her and passed her a small bowl filled with crushed, fragrant herbs to warm her cold hands. Awanasa offered her a piece of warm, savory flatbread made from cornmeal. No one told her what to do. No one explained the rituals. She was simply expected to be present, to listen, to be. After a while, Nantan, who had been sitting quietly by his grandfather, came and curled up beside her. He was still wrapped in her old wool blanket, but now Awanasa had stitched a single, perfect white eagle feather to the collar. He leaned his head against her arm. They thought I had died, he whispered, so softly only she could hear. When they were searching, I saw them crying for me. Clara looked down at him, stunned. You saw them? But you were here, unconscious. He looked up at her, his dark eyes seeming ancient in the firelight. I dreamed them, he said simply. I was looking for them through water. She didn't understand, but she didn't question it. She was beginning to realize there were more things on this mountain than were dreamt of in her philosophy. Some things weren't meant to be explained with logic. They were meant to be felt. As the fire crackled and the moon climbed high, Taza finally turned his attention to her. In our ways, he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the murmur of the others. A person who saves a life without seeking payment or reward becomes spirit-bound to the one they saved. He held up a hand to clarify, not owned, not tied like a rope, but seen. Your spirit and his are now known to each other, forever. Clara's heart fluttered. I didn't ask for anything, I couldn't leave him there. Which is why the circle was called, Taza said, with a solemn nod. It is to recognize the bond. Awanasa. The woman leaned forward. She dipped her fingers into a small pouch at her belt and retrieved a pinch of red ochre mixed with ash. Gently, she took Clara's hand, turned it palm up, and drew a small, intricate circle in the center. The mark was faint, but it felt as if it were burning into her skin. You are not of the people, Awanasa said, her voice soft but firm. But tonight, you are not a stranger. You are Ohali, a friend. The flames danced higher, and across the fire, Chaska met her eyes. The suspicion was gone. The anger was gone. In its place was a clear, steady respect. This land is your own, he said, his voice carrying a weight of promise. But should you ever be in need, should you ever call for aid, someone will answer. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, hot against her cold cheeks. She didn't let them fall. She felt the snow melting a little faster around her feet, as if the warmth of this circle, this acceptance, was changing the very season around her. And when she finally went back to her cabin and slept, her dreams were not of loss or loneliness. They were of a vast forest, where the ancient trees parted to make a safe path for a woman, a boy, and a fire that no wind could ever extinguish. Peace, she learned, was a fragile thing. A morning mist that burns away at the first touch of harsh sunlight. The sunlight came in the form of two riders from the valley. She saw them from the ridge as she gathered firewood, two dark figures moving with grim purpose up the narrow trail to her cabin. She recognized them immediately. Marshal Griggs, a man whose gut hung over his belt and whose eyes were as dull as lead, and his brother-in-law, Boone Thatcher. Boone was the dangerous one. He was thin and wiry, with a nervous energy and pale, restless eyes that never seemed to settle. They were the kind of men who wore their tin stars not as a symbol of justice, but as a license for cruelty. They were bullies who used the law as a club. Clara set her bundle of wood down and walked calmly back to her door. This was coming. She had known it. Inside, Nantan was sitting at the table with Awanasa, who had stayed behind to help him. He was grinding dried herbs with a stone pestle, his small hands moving with a newfound confidence. Taza and Chaska had vanished back into the trees before sunrise, leaving behind only the gifts of food and the faint red mark on her palm. Stay inside, Clara told them quietly, her voice low and firm. Both of you. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Awanasa nodded, her expression grim. Nantan looked up, his eyes wide with worry, but he obeyed. Men like Griggs and Boone didn't let things go. A story about a reclusive widow and an Apache child was too juicy a piece of gossip for a town like Redemption. They weren't coming for justice. They were coming to hunt. The knock on the door was sharp and arrogant. Mrs. McCall, open up! We need a word! Clara opened the door, but she didn't step aside. She filled the doorway with her body, her stance solid and unyielding. You can speak it from there, Marshal. Boone, ever the agitator, leaned on his saddle horn, a smirk playing on his thin lips. Heard you been keeping company, Clara. Word is you got yourself a wild one, an Apache boy. I found a wounded child, Boone, she said, her voice as even and cold as the winter ground. And I did what any decent human being would do. Griggs spat a wad of tobacco juice near her porch steps. It sizzled on the snow. You ain't a doctor, Clara, and you ain't his kin. It ain't your place. And it isn't your place to let children die of neglect, Marshal, she shot back. His eyes narrowed into piggy slits. Who said anything about neglect? We was tracking him. We would have found him. But you didn't, did you? She said, her voice dangerously soft. I did. So I have to assume you didn't ride all the way up this mountain just to thank me. A tense silence stretched between them. Then Boone's smirk widened. Some folks are getting nervous. Talk of Apache riders seen near this ridge. Dangerous times, Clara. It ain't safe for you to be harboring one of them. They came for their own, she said flatly. The boy is with his people now. They've already left. It was a lie, but it was the only one she had. Griggs swung himself off his horse, his boots thudding heavily on the packed snow. He hitched up his gun belt. That may be so, but we still need to see for ourselves. Search the cabin. No, she said. The word was not a plea. It was a granite wall. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for the edge of the door to push her aside. In a single, fluid motion, Clara stepped back, raised her rifle, and leveled it squarely at the center of his chest. The click of the hammer being pulled back was unnervingly loud in the sudden silence. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't blinking. Her eyes were chips of ice. "You lay one hand on this door, Marshal," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "And I swear to God, you will lose it." The world stopped. Griggs froze, his hand hovering in midair. Boone's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. They had known Clara McCall as a quiet, grieving widow. They were not prepared for the woman standing before them now. Boone finally found his voice, a nervous mutter. "She's gone full savage. Living up here alone has broke her mind." But Griggs was smarter than he looked. He held up a hand to silence his brother-in-law. His eyes weren't on Clara's face anymore. They were darting past her, into the shadows of the cabin. And he saw it. He saw the flicker of movement from the corner of the room. He saw the dark, watching eyes of the Apache woman standing silently in the gloom. And then his gaze shifted to the doorframe. He saw the faint red circle Awanasa had painted there earlier that morning. A ward, a symbol, a warning. He suddenly understood. This wasn't just about a reclusive widow anymore. This ridge was claimed. He was trespassing on ground he didn't understand, tangling with forces that didn't answer to his tin star. "This ridge ain't worth dying on," Griggs muttered, slowly lowering his hand and taking a step back. He turned without another word, heaved himself back onto his horse, and spurred it down the trail. Boone hesitated, his pale eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and frustration. He looked at Clara, at the rifle she still held steady, and then spat on the ground. "This ain't over." Then he wheeled his horse and followed the marshal, leaving only threats hanging in the cold air. Clara stood there until they were long out of sight, the rifle still pressed to her shoulder. Only then did she lower it, her arms suddenly trembling with adrenaline. Inside, Nantan and Awanasa emerged from the shadows. The boy looked at her with an expression of pure awe. "You are not like them," he said. "No," Clara breathed, finally bolting the door. "I never was." But now, the whole valley would know it. The lines had been drawn. And she knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that trouble never just vanished. It circled back, lower and hungrier than before. The next morning, the sky was a brilliant cloudless blue, but it offered no comfort. Clara felt a storm gathering on the horizon, one made of rumor and malice. She stepped outside with Nantan. The boy no longer needed her arm to walk. His limp was barely noticeable now, a slight favor to his mended leg. His spirit, however, was stronger than ever. Together, they stood on the edge of the ridge, looking out over the valley where the small town of Redemption was a smudge of smoke and wood in the distance. "Will they come back?" Nantan asked, his voice quiet. "The men with the stars." "Probably," Clara said, her gaze fixed on the valley. "But I don't think they'll bother knocking next time." He nodded, a solemn, adult-like gesture that sat strangely on his young face. He reached into the small leather pouch at his waist, the one she had never touched, and pulled out a small, curious object. It was a piece of dark, oily coal and a shard of flint. He looked up at her, a silent question in his eyes. "Can I?" Clara managed a faint smile. She was far past questioning his ways. "I don't know what it means, son, but if it's what you need to do, you do it. He moved to a small, rocky outcrop behind the cabin, a place where the wind was steady and the trees were far enough apart to give a clear view of the sky. He gathered a small pile of dry twigs and tinder with practiced ease. He struck the flint against a stone, and soon a tiny, controlled fire was flickering to life. It was nothing big enough to draw unwanted attention from the town, but it was enough for eyes that knew what to look for. Then he unwrapped a small packet of dried herbs and what looked like powdered stone from a piece of hide and threw it onto the flames. The fire changed instantly. The smoke, instead of being white or gray, turned a deep, impossible blue. It didn't billow and disperse. It rose in a thin, steady, tight curl, a deliberate signal ascending into the vast sky. Clara stood beside him, watching the blue smoke paint a question mark against the heavens. Is that a message? It says that I am safe, Nantan whispered, his eyes fixed on the rising smoke. It says the woman of this cabin is a friend. But it also says that the people must watch the white men now, not me, them. Clara swallowed hard. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. You think the tribe will come back because of this? He finally turned to look at her, a strange, knowing smile on his face. They never left, he said. They are just behind the trees you stopped looking at. And suddenly, the forest felt alive again. The familiar stands of pine no longer seemed empty. She felt the weight of unseen eyes, heard whispers in the soughing of the wind through the branches. She wasn't alone, but she wasn't entirely safe either. That evening, as dusk settled, she saw them. 2 riders on horseback stopped at the edge of the far stream that marked the boundary of her land. They weren't Apache, and they weren't lawmen. Their clothes were dark and functional, their hats pulled low. They sat their horses with the slumped patience of predators. She couldn't place them, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. She didn't wake Nantan, who was sleeping soundly by the fire. She didn't say a word to Awanasa. She slipped out of the cabin alone, her rifle slung across her back. She moved through the darkness like a shadow, her feet sure on the familiar ground. Near the stream, in a small clearing visible from the ridge, she knelt. She placed 3 flat stones on the frozen earth, one on top of the other. It was a simple signal her own father, a trapper, had taught her years ago. It meant danger. It meant strangers in the territory. It meant, watch your back. She walked back to her cabin and stood on the porch, staring into the impenetrable darkness of the woods. You said you would answer, she whispered to the wind, a prayer to the unseen watchers. I'm calling. High on the opposite ridge, far beyond her line of sight, a second, smaller plume of smoke rose in answer. Not blue this time. A quick, sharp puff of white. Message received. The attack came without warning. There was no knock, no shout. Just the terrifying crash of splintering wood as the cabin door was kicked clean off its hinges. Clara jolted awake from a shallow, restless sleep by the fire. Awanasa screamed. Nantan, acting on pure instinct, scrambled from his cot and dove under it. 2 men stormed inside, their faces grim and shadowed by the brims of their dusty hats. They weren't Griggs or Boone. These men were harder, leaner, their eyes cold and empty. They were outsiders, their clothes worn from long, hard riding. The rifles they carried weren't for show. They were tools of a bloody trade. Mercenaries. Where is he? The taller one growled, his voice like gravel. He kicked her rocking chair, sending it crashing into the wall. Clara was on her feet in an instant, her hands raised to show she was unarmed, but her spine ramrod straight. He's not yours to take. He's an Apache brat with a bounty on his head, the second, shorter man snarled, his eyes darting into the dark corners of the room. Now give him up, lady, before you get hurt. A bounty? Clara's blood ran cold. From who? Not from this town. The railroad, the tall man snapped, taking a menacing step toward her. Man named Thorne. He wants no trouble on the new survey trail. An Apache chief's kid running around brings the whole nest down on his head. He wants him gone. Permanently. Clara moved, positioning herself directly in front of the cot where Nantan was hiding. Her body was a shield. He's a child. He was bleeding to death in a ditch. That ain't our problem, the short man muttered, spotting Nantan's foot sticking out from under the cot. There he is. The taller man raised his rifle, aiming it at Clara's heart. You really want to die for a stray savage, lady? It ain't a noble way to go. And then came the sound. It was soft, but it cut through the tense air like a knife, a whistle. One high, clear note, like a nightjar, echoing from the trees just outside. The two mercenaries froze. Their heads snapped toward the broken doorway. A second whistle answered the first, from a different direction. Closer. A third whistle, closer still from behind the cabin. They were surrounded. Clara allowed herself a grim, cold smile. I think you should leave now. The tall man let out a short, incredulous laugh. You and what army? Before the words were even out of his mouth, something sliced through the air. Thwip! An arrow, fletched with hawk feathers, flew through the open doorway and embedded itself deep in the wall, inches from his head. It quivered there, a deadly messenger. He spun around, his face a mask of shock and rage, bringing his rifle up. But he was too late. Shadows detached themselves from the deeper shadows of the forest. Figures moved with a liquid grace, silent and swift, sliding through the trees like fog. They were armed with bows, knives, and a righteous fury. The mercenaries panicked. They bolted for the door, desperate to get to their horses. The shorter one made it out, screaming in terror as he ran blindly into the dark pines. The taller one wasn't so lucky. A figure stepped from the darkness just beside the doorway. It was Chaska. His movement was a blur of controlled violence. He didn't use a weapon. The butt of his hand connected with the side of the mercenary's head with a sickening crack. The man's eyes rolled back, and he dropped to the floor like a sack of grain, out cold. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her legs felt weak. Taza emerged from the trees behind his son, flanked by 3 more silent, grim-faced warriors. Awanasa rushed from the corner and knelt beside the cot, murmuring soothingly in their tongue as Nantan crawled out, trembling but unharmed. Taza stepped over the unconscious mercenary and looked at Clara. The respect in his eyes was deeper than ever. Your signal was clear, he said, his voice a low rumble. You told us strangers were watching. And their signal was clear too, Clara said, her voice shaking slightly. A man named Thorn, from the railroad. He put a bounty on Nantan's head. They want him gone for good. Taza's expression hardened into granite. Then we must move, before more of them come. Where? Clara asked, a sense of despair washing over her. Where can you go? They'll hunt you across the territory. There's no place they won't follow. Taza looked from her, to the trembling boy clinging to Awanasa, and then back to her. His gaze was heavy, profound. That is why, he said slowly, each word landing with the force of a hammer blow. He will not be going with us. Clara stared at him, her mind unable to process what she was hearing. What are you saying? Awanasa stood up, her hand resting on Nantan's shoulder. She looked at Clara, her dark eyes full of a strange, powerful light. You returned his body to us from the fever, she said. Now he gives you his future. And in the stunned silence of the broken cabin, with an enemy unconscious on the floor and protectors standing in the doorway, Clara's entire world tilted on its axis. The fire had burned low again, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The unconscious mercenary had been dragged outside and tied to a tree, a silent, grim trophy of the night's battle. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of pine, wood smoke, and a decision so momentous it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Nantan leaned against Clara's side, his fear replaced by a quiet exhaustion. His small fingers were wound tightly in the fabric of her sleeve, anchoring himself to her. Across from her, Taza sat on the floor, his posture as immovable and ancient as the mountain itself. Chaska stood guard by the shattered doorway, a silent, watchful sentinel. Awanasa sat beside Clara, her presence a source of calm strength. "You want me to keep him?" Clara finally managed to say, her voice a raw whisper. To raise him? Here? As my own?" It was Awanasa who answered, her voice gentle but firm. "Among the people, this is not dishonor. It is the deepest bond. When you saved him, his spirit chose you. He is already yours in a way we cannot deny." Chaska spoke from the doorway, his voice low and practical, devoid of the poetry of his elders. "We cannot protect him from the white man's government forever, from their soldiers, their laws, their greed. They will hunt a boy traveling with us, but they will not look for him here. No one expects a settler woman on a lonely ridge to be raising the grandson of a Chiricahua chief. It is the only place he might truly be safe. It is the only way he lives to become a man." The terrible, simple logic of it settled in Clara's gut like a cold stone. They weren't abandoning him. They were trying to save him in the only way they knew how. She looked down at the boy. His dark eyes searched hers, not with fear, but with a quiet, trembling hope that terrified her more than any rifle. "I'm just one woman," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'm alone." "You were not alone tonight," Awanasa said softly, "and you will not be." "But they'll come back," Clara insisted, her mind racing with the terrifying possibilities. This man Thorne, the lawmen, others with badges, with bounties, with orders. "Then we will come back too," Chaska said from the door, his words a solemn vow. "The signal you gave us tonight, you can give it again. When you call, we will answer. Always." Taza leaned forward, his gaze intense. "He will be one of us, always. We will come for him when it is time for him to learn the ways. He will ride with us. He will speak our tongue. He will know our gods. But he will live, because a woman with a strong heart chose to love him without first asking if it was safe." The room fell silent. Clara closed her eyes, and her life replayed in her mind's eye. The lonely grave she had dug with her own 2 hands on the hill behind the cabin. The endless, silent winters, with only the ache in her bones for company. The hollow echo of her own cries for help when the fever had taken her husband, cries that no one had ever answered. And now, here was this boy. This small, broken, brave child, clutching her sleeve as if she were the only solid thing in the world. He must have felt her turmoil because he spoke, his voice trembling, but clear. "Will you teach me?" he asked, looking up at her. "How to make the stew, how to fix the roof when the wind blows the shingles off." A single tear escaped from beneath Clara's eyelid and traced a hot path down her cheek. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Yes," she choked out. "And you'll have to teach me your songs." Taza stood, the decision made. "Then it is done." Awanasa reached out and pressed a small, intricately woven circle of sweetgrass and beads into Clara's palm. "This is a symbol of family," she said, "for one who is not of our blood." "Especially for one who is not of our blood," Clara replied, her voice growing stronger. They left as they had come, melting into the pre-dawn darkness without a sound. They left behind the tied-up mercenary as a warning, a gift of food, and the woven circle in her hand. They left behind no trail, no spoken promise of a date of return, just the profound, unshakable knowledge that they were out there, watching, waiting. As the shattered door was propped shut against the coming dawn, Nantan curled up on his cot, pulling the wool blanket up to his chin. Just before he drifted off to sleep, he whispered one word into the quiet of the room. "Mother." Clara, who thought she had buried that word on the lonely hill behind her house, felt it echo through the empty spaces in her heart. It filled them not with grief, but with a fierce, terrifying, and beautiful new purpose. She didn't correct him. How could she? The snow melted slowly that year, as if the seasons themselves were hesitant to rush what had so carefully taken root on that ridge. Spring arrived not with a sudden burst, but as a slow, creeping green that reclaimed the land from the white of winter. The cabin and the small yard around it were transformed. They were no longer a monument to a solitary existence, but a testament to life. There were 2 sets of muddy footprints by the door. The fence around the chicken coop, once dilapidated, was now mended with sturdy new posts. The constant, oppressive silence had been replaced by a new sound, the sound of a boy's laughter, a sound that never asked for permission to exist. Nantan, who was still Nantan in the quiet moments between them, was now also known as Samuel to the mail rider who came once a month, and to the circuit preacher who had been stunned to find the widow McCall's home occupied by a bright, curious boy she simply introduced as my son. Clara had hung Nantan's medicine pouch on a peg over the hearth, right beside the faded portrait of her late husband. 2 worlds, her past and her future, side by side. She never touched the pouch, but she dusted it with a quiet reverence. They both understood the silent treaty that existed between them. A child found, a woman remade, a family forged not of blood, but of circumstance and choice. Their silent guardians kept their promise. Once every few weeks, a single feather would appear, stuck into the top of a fence post. Sometimes a red-tailed hawk feather, signifying watchfulness. Sometimes a blue jay feather, a message of news from afar. There were never any words, never a rider seen. Just a constant, quiet reassurance that the trees still had eyes, and that the vow made in the firelight had not been forgotten. When a nosy rancher from down the valley rode up one day, full of suspicion and pointed questions about the Apache boy, Clara had just looked at him with her cold, steady eyes. "He's my son, Mr. Abernathy." When the man smirked and muttered something about squaw lovers, she had calmly picked up her rifle from the porch. "I can still hit a running jackrabbit at 200 yards, she'd said, her voice deceptively sweet. "And you're a much bigger target. Now, did you have any more questions?" He had turned his horse and left in a hurry. They always did. One bright spring afternoon, Clara found Nantan, Samuel, sitting by the stream, carefully carving symbols into the damp mud with a stick. They weren't letters. They were pictures, designs, full of spirals and lines. "What are you drawing?" she asked, sitting on the bank beside him. "Home," he said, without looking up. "But the way the earth understands it, not with walls, with connections." He pointed with the stick. "This is the mountain, this spiral is the wind, and this tree has roots that are deep and wide, touching everything." She watched him for a long time, the boy who was becoming a man, the child of 2 worlds who was somehow, miraculously, building a bridge between them, right here on her land. "Will you ever leave?" she asked, the question a lump in her throat. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes serious and full of a wisdom far beyond his years. "Someday," he said honestly, "Taza says I must, not to run away from this life, but to walk back to the other one, to sit at their fire and thank them for letting me stay here long enough to become strong." He paused, then reached out and took her hand, his own now almost as large as hers. "But when I go, I will come back, because you were the first person who didn't leave." That night, as the sun set, a great hawk circled low over the ridge, its cry a lonely, piercing sound in the twilight. It dipped its wings once, then vanished into the dark pines. Clara stood on her porch, not bothering to light the lantern. She didn't need to. The moon was bright enough. She looked out into the forest, into the watchful darkness that was no longer a threat, but a promise. "He's still yours," she whispered to the unseen guardians, and the wind, rustling through the leaves, seemed to answer her back. "So are you." The cabin held steady against the night, no longer just a shelter for the lost, but a home for the chosen. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of the strange, the mysterious, and the resilient, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. You never know what's waiting just over the next ridge.